I mean, Monticello was packed.
But Montpelier not.
Yeah, none.
Tells you that Jefferson's hold on the imagination continues.
It sure does. I always think it's odd that Madison doesn't have anything in Washington, D.C. to commemorate his constitutional stuff. I'm glad Jefferson does, but Madison is not quite, doesn't have quite the allure that Jefferson does.
So why do you suppose that's true?
I think one of the reasons is because Madison's presidency is not so successful, right? The war is not great. He's not he doesn't have the eloquence and the presence and the mystique that Jefferson has to be Jefferson in that moment, because he's talking out of both sides of his mouth in a way that Madison didn't talk about slavery much. So I think it's just a complicated legacy, but I think he probably gets more condemnation than he deserves, but he also gets more praise than he deserves.
So let me stop you right there. This is the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I think you know. You're saying he gets more praise than he deserves. How can that possibly be?
Well, I mean, I do think he deserves everything he that has come to him. But he's not alone in some of the great advances he makes. He's not on an island in terms of the writing that he does. I give some credit to the Ben Franklins of the world that helped him craft some of those things, despite the fact that he's the greatest. As I said last time I was talked to you, he's the greatest poet of the 18th century, political poet of the 18th century. Jefferson is the greatest.
This week on the Thomas Jefferson Hour, my conversation with Skidmore College history professor Beau Breslin about the things that wound up on the cutting room floor during the founding generation of American history. Why was John Dickinson's guarantee of women's religious freedom removed from his draft of the Articles of Confederation? Why did James Madison persuade Jefferson not to send his old friend John Adams a congratulatory letter after the 1796 presidential election? Above all, how would American history have been different if Jefferson's attack on the slave trade had not been removed from the Declaration of Independence at the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia? Would Jefferson's attack on slavery have brought emancipation to the enslaved people of this country, or would it merely have brought on the Civil War right from the start? Would we judge Jefferson more charitably if his denunciation of slavery had been included in the final draft? Join us for all that and more on this week's Thomas Jefferson Hour. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. This week, I talk with William Breslin of Skidmore College, the author of A Constitution for the Living. We had that conversation a few months ago, and you were the first person that I ever had the chance to talk about the possibility that Jefferson was right, that we should revise or tear up the Constitution once per generation. But today, our subject is a little bit different, something you're working on now, and that's what might be called founders' edits. Things that wound up on the cutting room floor that, if they had stayed in these famous documents, might have changed in some ways the course of American history. So welcome to the Jefferson Hour.
Thank you, Clay, and please call me by my informal name. My informal name is Beau, so call me Beau.
I will call you Beau. I knew that, but I just wanted to make sure that you were comfortable with that. All right, so Beau, let's start with the preamble to the Constitution of the United States. It's about 4,000 words long, the whole Constitution. The Committee on Detail was largely dominated by Gouverneur Morris. Gouverneur Morris is, in some sense, the prose stylist who wrote the Constitution of the United States in the late summer of 1787. And as I understand it, at first, it actually enumerated every state rather than we the people. So tell that story.
The Committee of Detail responsibility for taking all of the ideas and debates and putting them in prose, right? Putting them in actual constitutional document. We always we underappreciate the Committee of Detail, but it had the responsibility of writing the text. And as you said, the preamble was part of what the Committee of Detail did, and essentially it came out with a preamble that we would not recognize today, right? So the preamble, and I won't read all the states, but the preamble essentially said, "We, the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and went through all the states, do ordain, declare, and establish the following constitution for the government of ourselves and our posterity. So the great lofty language that eventually Gouverneur Morris sort of takes over, and the great lofty language of our preamble was simply not there. And the Committee of Detail comes out with it. And what's interesting about Clay, about that proposal, right, that the Committee of Detail had, the preamble, is that that would have fundamentally changed many parts of the direction or the evolution of the development of the United States. And I'm going to talk about one in particular.
But let me just hold you there, Beau, for 1 minute. So let me make sure everyone knows what did happen. So the final form, which almost all school children encounter and maybe memorize, is "We the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." So that is the final masterful form. And your point is going to be that it's not just better as literature, it makes a fundamental difference on how we interpret the meaning of the Constitution.
Exactly. And it is lofty, beautiful, eloquent language, but it fundamentally changed the way in which we think about both the polity itself and the Constitution as a document. Clay, the best example of that is to think about the great John Marshall case in McCulloch versus Maryland, right? There's lots of ways you can think about how we, the people of the United States, as opposed to we, the people of the various states, fundamentally changed the direction of the United States. But I think the most concrete example is in McCulloch versus Maryland. And I know recently you did, with Lindsay, you did a thing on John Marshall, right? John Marshall was a master at manipulating, and I'll use that term deliberately, manipulating parts of the law and the Constitution in order to fulfill the notion that the national government or the federal government was going to be supreme over the states. And McCulloch is one of his great cases. You know, Marbury, McCulloch, maybe Gibbons. McCulloch is one of its great cases. And for folks out there, the case was fairly simple. It involved whether or not the federal government could charter a bank and whether or not Maryland could tax that bank. And one of the arguments that the Maryland folks made was that the federal government, Congress, could not charter a bank because the Constitution emanates from the states. And if it emanates from the states and the power, the locus of power is in the states, then the federal government doesn't have the enumerated power to charter a bank and thus cannot do it. And Marshall said, no, the Constitution doesn't emanate from the states, it emanates from the people. Maryland's retort was that, well, there were ratification debates in the states. Marshall's response to that was, well, that was the efficient way to do it. How else are you going to do it? But my question for you in this conversation is, what if that original preamble that listed the states, we the people of the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and so on, was still in there? Marshall could not have used that argument as in reinforcing the power of the federal government, or could not have used it as easily. And that's a critical moment in American history when Marshall says the Constitution emanates from the people of the United States, not from the states. The preamble, that change was fundamental to not only the development, but also individuals like Marshall jumping off that notion that the Constitution emanates from the collective people. Justice Thomas is a great example of those people who will question that. It's really fun to watch Thomas's opinions on things because he's a little, but Justice Thomas has recently said it emanates from the people of the states, not the collective people. Marshall disagreed, and I think the preamble helped him with that argument, even though he doesn't cite it.
A couple of things. First of all, I think Jefferson would have liked the original language. He always believed he was a Virginian first, and that Virginia was its own nation, commonwealth, and that there was a kind of voluntary confederation, and that this was maybe not sufficiently strong in fiscal terms, but that for all practical purposes, the state should be sovereign in everything except international affairs. So he probably would have liked that reading. Do we know anything about what made Gouverneur Morris changed from the original enumeration of states to the much more beautiful general approach.
Yeah, so there's not much evidence in the notes about what that change was, but I have some speculation that I do think that for the most part, Gouverneur Morris, super smart guy, Gouverneur Morris and most of the framers intended for the Constitution to emanate from the people, that it was a collective decision. And my evidence of that, Clay, is ratification, right? Ratification, we take ratification we sort of don't spend a lot of time thinking about ratification. But of course, ratification was a big deal. I think Gordon Wood said, this is a new idea. And I'm always struck by what the project was, the constitutional project, right? And I think Hamilton probably said it best in Federalist One, right? The question is whether or not a group of people can collectively decide what form of government they want by sitting around a table, right, in Philadelphia, and deciding that this is going to be the best type of government for our national protection and for our liberties. That idea was new, but you had to get the people to sign on to it. And so this notion that Article 7, that you needed to ratify the text, is a novel idea. There are several novel ideas, one of which is conventions, ratifying conventions in the first place. My thinking is that Gouverneur Morris was well aware of the fact that ratification was a big deal, that it was a novel idea, and that you didn't need to ratify. All you needed was state legislatures to say yes, but instead we'll have ratifying conventions with the people, because that's the way a collective people can agree to live under these rules. I think he was smart that way. I don't know if everybody in the room was smart that way, but ultimately I think that's what he was thinking.
We tend to take the Constitution for granted, that, you never really think about, well, who actually sat down and wrote it, put all the notes in front of him of different provisions for elections, for impeachment, for ratifying treaties, for coinage of money, the enumerated powers, how you amend this thing and under what circumstances, etc. But somebody had to gather all those notes and try to rationalize them and put them into really strong prose. And that wasn't Gouverneur Morris alone, but he was the principal draftsman. So I think we need to always remember that this was a literary moment. These things don't just happen, that this had to be crafted and organized, and that process, I think, deserves a lot more attention than it has received. But then you have McCulloch versus Maryland. Justice Marshall, no friend to Jefferson. In all of his major decisions for his 34 years on the court, he emphasized national power, national government, national sovereignty, and reduced the states, to the extent that he could get away with it, to more subordinate sovereignty. Two things about that. First of all, absolutely would have appalled Thomas Jefferson, and he was aware of some of it, but not all of it. And secondly, it is kind of a coup d'etat. I mean, Marshall's making these decisions. He's not elected. He's appointed for life. He doesn't have to stand for re-election. There's no vote of confidence or no confidence. There's no appeal. And so he is changing the Constitution. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention. He is materially changing the Constitution to fit his own philosophy of government, which he doesn't hold alone, of course, but it does not represent a debate by the American people about how they should construe this thing. So it's amazing that he did it, and even more amazing that, in a sense, he got away with it.
Marshall is, as I said, he's a judicial genius in some ways, because of the fact that he was able to, as I said, I'll use this term deliberately, manipulate particular things. McCulloch is one of those instances where he manipulates a couple of things. His most famous manipulation is, of course, Marbury versus Madison. Thomas Jefferson Hour, if it hasn't already done it, should do an episode on Marbury versus Madison as a fascinating example of judicial statecraft, right? It's Marshall manipulates or misreads various things, including the semicolon in Section 13 of the Judiciary Act. Fascinating the way in which he set out to achieve two goals, Clay. He wanted two things, Marshall. One was he wanted to establish the federal government as a superior power over the states. That's the McCulloch versus Maryland and Gibbons versus Ogden and so on. Simultaneously, he wants to establish the Supreme Court as a co-equal branch with the other two, and that's the Marbury versus Madison. More so than any other justice, I think, in the history of the Supreme Court, he is able to achieve those goals in ways that were beyond measure.
We need to take a short break. We'll do a program. You'll be in it. We'll talk about Marbury v. Madison. Every law student encounters Marbury v. Madison almost in week number 1. We need to take a short break. We're talking with Beau Breslin of Skidmore College. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. We'll be back in just a moment. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour with Beau Breslin, the author of a really fascinating book on the Constitution of the United States, a Constitution for the Living, imagining how 5 generations of Americans would have rewritten the nation's fundamental law. We've had that conversation before. So, Beau, let's move on. Another one of the sort of cutting room floor moments, or the edits by the founders, was an odd thing involving John Dickinson and the possibility of women being explicitly granted religious freedom. So tell us that story.
Dickinson, fascinating guy. Like, he's one of the great and underappreciated founders. And as you know, Clay, his legacy was marred a little bit by the fact that he didn't sign the Declaration, right? He felt like we weren't quite ready, but he is, for all intents and purposes, he's at the table in almost every major founding moment, right? The founding period. He is the chairperson of the Annapolis Convention right before the Constitutional Convention. Before that, he's in the Second Continental Congress. He's in the First Continental Congress, right? He's in the Stamp Act Congress. One of his jobs in the Second Continental Congress he was given the task with a committee, but he did the major part of it, of writing the Articles. He's a big fan. He's not an actual Quaker, but he's a fellow traveler. And he's a big fan of constitutional government. When the resolution comes up to declare independence, there's also the resolution to write a constitution, and Dickinson is given that task. So Dickinson goes away, just like Jefferson did with the Declaration, and writes up a first draft of the Articles of Confederation. And he comes back. The Articles, I will mention 3 things that are unique about the Dickinson draft, which, by the way, you can find in the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. The Dickinson draft is much more focused on the concentration of centralized power in the federal government than the Articles ended up being. So he was a bigger fan of the idea of more power in the federal government than the rest of the Second Continental Congress that edited his work. Secondly, he has a statement in there that gets edited out about protections for Native peoples. He writes, their lands are to be secured to the, quote, their lands are to be secured to them and not encroached on, and that there should be persons appointed by the national government who will live with the Indians and make sure that all trade is just and fair, and that occasionally their needs and wants are met with supplies delivered by the national government. Fascinating, part of the Dickinson draft. But probably the most revolutionary part of Dickinson's draft is his willingness to include women in a clause protecting religious liberty. His first draft says, no person in any colony living peaceably under the civil government shall be molested or prejudiced in his or their person or estate for his or their religious persuasion or practice. I'll say it again. No person in any colony living peaceably under the civil government should be molested or prejudiced in his or their person or estate for his religious persuasion or practice. And he crossed it out, Clay, and put, instead of his or their, his or her. And the one he presented to the Second Continental Congress says, no person in any colony living peaceably under the civil government shall be molested or prejudiced in his or her person or estate for religious persuasion or practice. I think it is, Lindsay probably could tell us differently, but I think it's the first example of sort of an equality extended to women in religious liberty written into a document, and it gets edited out by the Second Continental Congress. He was influenced by his wife, Polly, and his Quaker upbringing, and he felt like there was equality afforded to women.
All right, so a couple of things. First of all, amazing. Thanks for telling this story. Articles of Confederation were the first Constitution of the United States, a loose confederation of states, required unanimous approval for any amendment. The government had to requisition monies from the individual states. Wasn't a disaster, as the Hamiltonians like to say, but it proved to be insufficiently strong, and that's what led the Annapolis Convention of 1786 and the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was meant to revise the Articles. Instead, they tore them up and started over, which was in itself a pretty bold and maybe illegal thing to do. But these three provisions, of course, more centralized power, clearly rejected by especially the smaller states. The idea that the government of the United States had a fiduciary trust relationship with native peoples and must go out of its way to protect them from unscrupulous trade and so on. In 1787, the Northwest Ordinance was passed by the outgoing Confederation Congress, and they said that the government must always show the utmost good faith in dealing with native peoples. Well, you can put that sort of stuff in any constitution you want, but it wasn't in the cards for this rising nation to really pay sufficient attention. And so that's one of the things that's disquieting, that the Constitution is a restraining document, but it can't overcome human dynamism in certain circumstances. Racism is going to survive the civil rights laws. We're going to treat natives as we're going to treat them, and I don't suppose anyone trying to open a new settlement in the Ohio Valley said, there's that provision in the Northwest Ordinance that says utmost good faith. So it's a great thing, and it shows what sort of a character John Dickinson had. I wish it had remained, but it didn't. And then finally, this view of his or her, I don't remember ever even hearing the phrase his or her before this document. It got thrown out. As you know, women were able to vote in, I think, New Jersey until 1808, and then they thought better of it and disenfranchised women. Dickinson comes off as sort of a proto-feminist here, and you think that the impulse largely came from Quakerism on the one hand and his strong wife.
I think those are the two greatest influences in his life. I also think Dickinson's an interesting guy, right? He's the guy who he spends a lot of time talking about slavery and its abhorrent moral reality. He's just an interesting progressive thinker. I think what he was influenced by was beyond just the two of them, two things, the Quakerism and also his wife. I think he genuinely believed in equality in a way that some of the other framers of the founding generation didn't necessarily agree with. It came out in terms of religious liberty, which for him, as a fellow traveler and essentially a Quaker, for him, equality in religious practice would have been the highest goal. I think he was just a really, as you say, proto-feminist, but I think it's just his moral spirit that essentially told him to do this. And it gets edited out, which is a shame. Interesting to think, Clay, what would have been any of the ripple effect or consequences, both for the the 1787 Constitution and beyond, if that anchor had been in place, the his or her. I'm not sure it would have been, but it's interesting to think about.
And we're talking with Beau Breslin about the things that wound up on the cutting room floor, at least some of them during the founding. In the first example that you gave of the preamble, I can see that that's fundamental. If the states had been enumerated, the anti-federalists, the people like Jefferson, the states' rightists would have seized upon that. Jurists would have seized upon it. I mean, it would be clear that this is a collection of state sovereignty producing a new national government. So when Gouverneur Morris changed it, that was material, and its impact has been colossal. But with John Dickinson, it feels a little less monumental. So let's say that those phrases had stayed in, his or her, and his view that Native Americans needed to be very carefully treated for fairness and justice. It doesn't feel that this would have had quite the same influence, and yet I can see Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton pointing to this provision if it had stayed in. I mean, in other words, it wouldn't have been just language. It would have had consequences.
So, yeah, it's clear that by the Annapolis Convention and certainly by Philadelphia in 1787, what we would describe as the drafters of the 1787 Constitution were mostly interested in structure. We need to shift power, right? We have power to the state from the states to the federal government. It may not have had the legs, Clay, that the preamble change would have had, but it feels to me a little bit there could have been moments in the 19th century in which this would have been resurrected, and at least we would have thought about it instead of the waiting until the early 20th century to give women the vote, for example. So I agree. The goal for the Constitutional Convention in 1787 was not to extend rights to women and that we were talking structure. But I also think it's fascinating to think how the country would have evolved differently if this had stayed in.
Impossible to imagine Mr. Jefferson saying, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women." Jefferson is a much more patriarchal figure than apparently John Dickinson was, and he would have resisted. He would have either said that men is a universal, and therefore it covers men and women and so on, or he would have said, no, women, as Jefferson said, tender breasts of ladies were not formed for political convulsion and stuff like that. Let me go to another one that's related to religion, and that's Jefferson's famous letter to the Danbury Baptists on January 1st, 1802. So the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut wrote to Jefferson congratulating him on his religious tolerance, enlightened ways, in a certain sense asked for an endorsement of his principles. And Jefferson used this occasion, as he often did, to try to sort of say once and for all the thing that we should keep in mind about a subject. And he famously said his reading of the First Amendment was that it, quote, erected a wall of separation between church and state. That was a very felicitous phrase by Thomas Jefferson. In the 20th century, it was adopted by the Supreme Court of the United States as the best paraphrase of the meaning of the First Amendment. It wasn't until William Rehnquist, I think in 1978, the court rejected that and said, why should Jefferson have this much influence? I mean, that it's a good phrase, but it's not a constitutional phrase, and so we've given it more credence and importance in jurisprudence than it deserves. And so I have this friend at the Library of Congress in the Rare Books Room, and I was there once, and he was writing a book about natural rights, and he said, you want to see the actual letter, the Danbury Baptist letter? And of course I said, yes. So he showed it to me, and then he said, we've used this super-duper back scanner that can go under and over and around. He said, what I've discovered is that what Jefferson actually wrote was a wall of eternal separation between church and state. So not wall of separation between church and state, but wall of eternal separation. And then apparently somebody, Madison or somebody, talked him off that ledge, and Jefferson crossed it out and just left it at wall of separation. It would have been so much stronger had he kept that phrase in. But this is the technology of our time. This wasn't discovered until we had technology that could read behind the crossings out and the ink blots and so on. Ripple effect. So, the Founding Fathers are at the source of this stream. We're way, way down, and we're at Memphis, and it's all muddy and flooding and it's chaos. But they're at the source, and so the things they decide are going to have monumental influence over the future of American constitutionalism and American liberty. So imagine if Jefferson had kept in wall of eternal separation. How would this have affected the discourse?
Speculation is always my fun forte for me. I think it might have been, when you talk about eternal separation, there's a number of different ways you can interpret that, Clay. And I don't know what Jefferson meant. I assume he means over a long period of time, but it could mean multiple things. And I think depending on what he meant by eternal, that ripple effect would have been different. I know we're going to get to, I just want to say here, one of the great ironies, I would say, Clay, is that maybe the greatest penman in the history of the United States is Jefferson. So many of his things were edited either by him or by others. He's the most eloquent, and he's considered in the framing generation as the greatest writer of that generation. We're going to talk a little bit about some of his other edits. I think that eternal edit also changes the fundamental meaning. What do you think?
Well, I think a couple of things. First of all, this kind of gets us in the direction of slavery, the anti-slavery manifesto that was embedded at first in the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And here's why, Beau. I think Jefferson is a very great writer, the greatest of certainly the founding generation, without question. That's why he got the assignment. He also needs an editor. And that's a little odd to have to say of the great Jefferson, but he does, because he's an emotional man and he's a passionate man, and he frequently slightly overdoes it. And so I think there's a little bitterness in wall of eternal separation, as if there's anger there. And I think that when he calmed down, or when somebody looked at it and said, well, maybe that doesn't really add much there, it may even discredit it to a certain degree, then he comes into a calmer state. And remember, in the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, in the famous preamble to that, his greatest hit, he thought, at the end of it, he says, And I understand this, that no law is ever eternal, that every generation can sort of rewrite and do what they want with the law because the earth belongs to the living. But he says, but if you do, you'll be wrong. Don't ever mess with this. Don't ever touch this. This is eternal. This is not something that you're free. And he says, I know that has no force of law, but I'm just saying it. I'm just saying, please don't ever mess with this law, no matter what you think. I think there's some of that in eternal here, too. Like, there might be backsliding. We might be moving back towards a collapse of the wall of separation between church and state. I want you to know how emphatically I believe this.
I think that's probably the right reading. Let me ask you this question, and that is, Jefferson can be a pragmatic man. He can be a practical man. He wants to get things done, right? He has a vision, as you've described to your listeners a lot. He has a vision for the country, but he's a practical man. And sometimes there is a genuine clash between his deep respect for words and prose and his practical side. When Benjamin Franklin is editing his Declaration of Independence, he's pissed about a number of those edits. Educate me a little bit about that internal clash about, I need to have great prose, but I also need to be practical.
Here's how I read it, and I'd be really interested in your response. I see Jefferson as a utopian. And in his mind's eye, he has a picture of the yeoman farmer working in the field by day and reading Homer in the original Greek at night, and people sharing food, almost a barter economy, and people being entirely self-sufficient and coming together as ideal patriot citizens and not needing parties or faction and having rational decisions on all questions, and that we would turn our backs on the rest of the world and be kind of a super Canada, or a nation that's kind of left alone because it's minding its own business. It doesn't have any agenda in the world's arena. I think that's his vision. It's a magnificent vision. It's why I love Jefferson, because I believe that he was our dreamer, and he dreamed of what humans could actually achieve on Earth if we ever got it together. And I don't think that it's impossible. I mean, Adams would say, are you nuts? Have you looked around? And Hamilton would say, no, man is corrupt. There's no, Jefferson's not an Augustinian. He's not a Calvinist. He doesn't believe in original sin. He doesn't believe that humans are infected with self-destructive energies. He thinks that's just bad government and the past. So I love that about it, but I also know it's not true. You can't live on this side of Auschwitz and Hiroshima and really hold that argument without a number of important footnotes. He said early on in his life, we must never attempt more than the people can bear. And so I get the sense, Beau, that he had this vision, this magnificent pastoral Virgilian vision of a small R republic, and he never let it go. But he also knew, all right, it's Tuesday. I've got to send a message to Congress. We have to handle the Louisiana Purchase Treaty. In other words, he was a utopian pragmatist and a pragmatic utopian, so that he was saved in two ways. Saved because he did understand this concept that you can dream America, but you can't necessarily convince everybody to go along. And secondly, he had Madison, and Madison would say, well, let's think about this. Let's pull back a little bit on this maybe. And I think that's essential to understanding Jefferson.
I'm always struck by the fact that Jefferson is the poet of the framing generation. And yet he sees the world with a lens that Hamilton disagreed with. So Hamilton is the engine of the framing generation. He's the visionary because we live in a Hamiltonian world. But Jefferson should never lose his place because he is the poet of the framers.
I couldn't agree with you more. And just imagine American history without Jefferson in it, without Monticello, without the Library of Congress as a universal library, without public architecture at Richmond and the U.S. Capitol. So we'll take a short break. When we come back, I want to talk with you about a letter that Jefferson wrote to John Adams, and then we will get into the biggest of these edits, the famous anti-slavery manifesto in the first draft of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. This is a special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. My friend Beau Breslin is here with me, and we are talking about the edits and the cutting room floor of the founding era in American history. We'll take a short break. We'll be back. You are listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to this special edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Things that wound up on the cutting room floor, to use a slightly out-of-date metaphor. I'm talking to Beau Breslin, the author of that extraordinary book on constitutional revision. Every 5 times you had it in your book. I want to go to a letter that Jefferson wrote in 1796. So in 1796, as everyone knows, Jefferson reluctantly allowed himself to be put forward as a candidate for the presidency. I don't think he had what we call fire in the belly at this time. He was willing, but he wasn't that eager. And of course, he always posed as the person who would rather be home with his rutabagas. But assuming that we take him seriously, that he wasn't zealous to be president in 1796, he lost to his old friend, John Adams, and he got the second number of electoral votes, did Jefferson, so he was vice president. And so now he's going to be in office with a dear friend of his, but they no longer agree on much. And so Jefferson, in his usual graceful way, Beau, writes a letter to John Adams in which he says, you're my senior, and I've always been a junior player in all of this, and it seems quite appropriate that you would be elected. I didn't lose a moment's sleep over this. I'd rather be at Monticello. I have no desire to govern men. It's a thankless business. I will be pleased, etc. It's a quintessential Jefferson letter, and he meant it. This is Jefferson. He's the most gracious of the Founding Fathers by far. As he sometimes did, he first sent it to his pal, James Madison, and said, what do you think? What do you think? And Madison wrote back this incredible letter, because he's always talking Jefferson off the ledge. He writes and says, I don't know that you want to send that letter to the president. And here's what he says, Beau. He said, this being the state of things between you, it deserves to be considered whether the idea of bettering it is not outweighed by the possibility of changing it for the worse. So this might have the wrong effect. It might be seen as hypocrisy. He says, you know the temper of Mr. A, he says Mr. A, better than I do, but I have always conceived it to be rather a ticklish one. And then at the end he says, considering, this is point 6 in his letter, considering the probability that Mr. A's course of administration may force an opposition to it from the Republican quarter, he doesn't say us, but he means us, considering the probability that Mr. A's course of administration may force an opposition to it from the Republican quarter, and the general uncertainty of the posture which our affairs may take, who knows what's going to happen here, there may be a real embarrassment from giving written possession to him of the degree of compliment and confidence which your personal delicacy and friendship have suggested. Translation, don't send that letter. You're going to regret it. You're going to have to break with him. He's going to do crazy stuff. If you send that letter, he'll either hold you to that loyalty, or it'll be shown that you betrayed him. And it might even, if he releases the letter, it might be seen as hypocrisy, since everyone knows you don't really agree with this man. And Madison says, just pocket it. All right, so he does. Jefferson almost invariably lets Madison be his censor. So the question I have for you, Beau, is what if? Because when Adams and Jefferson met on the street in Philadelphia after the election results were in, Adams said something like, we're old friends. Both of us kind of hate the factionalism. We could maybe, in some limited respects, together govern the country for the next 4 years. And then they both think better of it. But what would have happened if Jefferson had sent the letter and that he and Adams had found a way to bring a consensus harmony to their policies?
I generally think Madison is accurate about the way in which he imagines scenarios, right? So we have some history there. I think 2 things would have happened. One is Madison was right in saying that Adams would have probably held Jefferson to the honor of what he said in that letter. So that would not have served Jefferson well in that particular moment. Clay, the other thing that probably would have happened is by the election of 1800, things are between the two of them are so bad. It's possible and probable that Adams would have used that letter to his advantage in a down in the mud political campaign of 1800. So I think there was an issue of honor there, that Adams would have expected Jefferson to honor what he says in the letter. But I also think it would have been a political tool for Adams in the election of 1800. I think Madison was right in convincing Jefferson to put it in his pocket.
I don't disagree with you, and I love what you said, that Madison had a way of imagining scenarios that was much more accurate than his friend. But don't you ache a little bit for what was lost? I mean, here's Jefferson with the deepest generosity that he has. He meant it. You're my senior. We're old friends. We may disagree around the edges, but we both want a republic. I mean, there's something really beautiful there that kind of is, again, that kind of dreamy outside of the hugger-mugger world of politics that is Jefferson.
Yes, but it takes two to tango in that moment. I think Adams was not necessarily receptive to the idea of a graceful dance with Jefferson.
This is counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened in any of these situations, really, but in this case, Madison rightly understood he and Jefferson were going to have to break with the Federalist operating system and propose a radically different or somewhat different way of going about the public business of the United States, and that you don't want to compromise your capacity to do that by being too friendly. Your friendship is important, don't get me wrong, but we're talking politics here, and you better be really cautious.
Clay, one of the things for me that I lament here, I think often about Jefferson's legacy. And there's no question about the fact that Jefferson has a long, deep, and impressive legacy. But these moments where he either gets advice from others, like Madison here, doesn't show what is his genuine, I think, authentic self, I think actually hurt his legacy over time, right? So especially in the relationship with Adams, which for the most part, I think Americans think is sort of roughly period of time in which they despised each other was roughly both of them owned it equally. If he sends this letter and Adams does what I think Adams does, uses it as a political tool or whatever, then Jefferson's legacy is enhanced by the fact that he's trying to build bridges, he's trying to cross the aisle, whatever contemporary term we're going to use. I worry about Jefferson's legacy not being as sparkling in this area, because as you say, he was the most gracious of the framers. And yet for him to put it in his pocket because Madison said it's a political liability is problematic for the way in which we look at Jefferson.
You talked about the legacy of Jefferson maybe not always seeming fully authentic. Part of that is the manners of the kind of Jane Austen novel world in which he lived, with exquisite politeness and you never confront anyone. And what was a strength for him, we can now regard as sort of a disingenuousness. But I don't think that's really fair. And look what's happened. I mean, the John Adams miniseries, magnificent, made John Adams like he's one of us. He's a guy you could have a beer with. He's earthy. He says everything. He's authentic. He's real. And that's a huge sea change. You know, Adams has usually been relegated to this sort of sputtering, toothless guy who never had a thought that he didn't find a way to express, usually in an offensive manner. And now he's like a hero because we think, oh, he's authentic, just like us. So that puts Jefferson in a slightly shaded light. But that really leads us to the big issue of our conversation today, Beau, which is the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson's 33. He's the youngest member of the Virginia delegation. In fact, he's an alternate to the Second Continental Congress. He has a reputation for being a brilliant pro-stylist and a great student of the history of liberty. It's a bit of a stretch, but he's offered the chance to write this thing. Franklin turns down his chance to be the primary author. Adams comes to Jefferson famously and said, you must write this document. Gives him 3 reasons and so on. So Jefferson drafts it, he says, in a single day, consulting neither book nor pamphlet. There was in the original draft the longest single paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, which was Jefferson's attack on the slave trade. And he accuses George III and the Parliament of England essentially of perpetuating the slave trade, and every time one of the colonies, for whatever reason, was trying to do maybe something to restrain it or to limit it or outlaw it, these were vetoed in London, and that this somehow was a way of imposing upon poor innocent us slavery, when we probably would have done the right thing if it hadn't been for the tyranny of George III. When this was debated in the Continental Congress, it was forced out, Jefferson said, at the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia. I just want to read it to you, or maybe you want to read it.
It's a fascinating passage, so you go ahead.
He has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, in other words, the Arabs, the Islamists, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. And that this assemblage of whores might want no fact of distinguished dye, he is now exciting those very people, the slaves, to rise in arms amongst us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urges them to commit against the lives of another. Longest single paragraph in the document. It didn't stand up very long, Beau.
Did not. And Clay, the Thomas Jefferson Hour has talked about this, but to me, this is the quintessential edit at the founding period. It's the most famous edit. It's also, I think, when you kind of spin it out in the ripple effect, I think it probably has the most interesting impact to imagine what the Declaration would have been and future generations would have thought of the Declaration in Jefferson. But think about what he's just said. First of all, he places blame on King George III, right? So he's shedding blame from us. Jefferson also writes in this, one of the most fascinating is when he said, in the persons of a distant people who never offended him. It's also kind of a moral, unjustified institution, slavery. Jefferson is saying those people never offended the king, and yet he is going straight into or has perpetuated the institution of chattel slavery. Then he talks about the most egregious violation for him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death. He talks about their loss of freedom. The implication is the stripping away of their homeland and their families and so on. He uses the term pirate. What is a pirate if not someone who is a marauder, somebody who's entirely interested in greed and has no empathy for any other people? So he calls the Christian king of Great Britain a part of this piratical warfare. So there's a lot packed into this particular paragraph, and it gets edited out.
This piratical warfare of the opprobrium of infidel powers. What he means is we normally associate this sort of human trafficking with the Islamic states of North Africa. These people who are barbarians and jihadists, and that's how we normally think of this. But here is the Christian king of Great Britain, the world's most important society, behaving in precisely the same way as these barbarians of North Africa. So that's one thing. And then he says, the veto, he has prostituted his negative, he means the veto. He said that you want to use the veto to ameliorate the condition of mankind, but he's using the veto for craven ends to keep up this practice to make the British trade more wealthy and profitable. This is also a constitutional misuse of his power. Lovely though this is, it's clearly not true. It's just not true that George III and the Parliament of England are responsible for widespread ownership of enslaved people in the New World. It's just not so. And so even though we get his point, the other people at the Continental Congress said, it's just not true. We're not putting that in.
True. But I'm always struck by the fact that I'm always fascinated by this. But were the other complaints about King George all entirely true?
No, but they were truer. This one is a whopper, right?
So it's a matter of degree. Fair enough. Fair enough.
But let's talk about implications. So first of all, quick answer. Do you agree that it was the Carolinas and Georgia essentially that said, we're not signing unless this goes?
Yes, because his autobiography, I take his autobiography at his word.
But he does remember, he also says, and interesting, a couple of the New England trading states were a little uncomfortable too.
Right, because they had the boats.
Right. They were the ones fattening up on the trade.
And I think it was mostly Georgia and Carolina.
If this had stayed, for all of its flaws in logic, this would have put our founding document in explicit language saying that slavery is incompatible with the ideals of the American Revolution. And this may not be enough, but it's our start. We're not going to birth the nation without attending to this fundamental issue. Is that a fair read?
I think that's totally a fair read. It would have fundamentally changed the way in which we think about the Declaration. How can you make an argument that Jefferson is a prose hypocrite? Sure, you can make an argument because he had slaves and so on. In his prose, he's not a hypocrite with all men are created equal if he has this final paragraph in. Then finally, I would mention, and that is Frederick Douglass' use of what to the slave is the 4th of July. The evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with the bones. And here's where he actually resurrects Jefferson's language. The slave trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy. It has been denounced with burning words from the high places of the nation as an execrable traffic. If that stays in, how does that change the way in which we think about the Declaration, Jefferson, Douglass, the Constitution, and so on? I just think it's a fascinating thing to speculate on.
I so appreciate your insights. This is a brilliant analysis. And I think you've proved that Frederick Douglass was working from that paragraph that he found in some document or other. He begins by quoting Shakespeare from Julius Caesar at the beginning of that passage. So here's this black man quoting the greatest poet in the English language and quoting the greatest American visionary. This must have surprised some of his auditors. But also, if you say we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and you don't mean it, then that's really cynical. I think Jefferson did mean it. I don't think he was quite aware of what that was going to mean, but he meant it. And if this paragraph had stayed in, it would have made it clear we intend to do the right thing. It doesn't say we're going to free our slaves. It just means we're on the path. We understand that there's a path forward that's a justice path, and it goes back to the preamble, which says all men are created equal. So that changes this document, not just in small ways, but fundamentally. Remember, when Lincoln was really working the Declaration in the 1850s, he said, either Jefferson meant everything or he meant nothing. But and it doesn't matter what he meant now, because we have to read it as everything, as a universal statement, or we just can't go on. And so he's reading Jefferson in the most generous possible way. Second thing is even more important to me personally, and that is that this would have changed the story of Jefferson dramatically, because as you know, right now, he's the poster child for the hypocrite founder. Nobody more than Jefferson. Of course, he said that crazy thing, all men are created equal, but he's really taken a deep and I think well-deserved drubbing over his complicity in race and slavery. But this paragraph changes the equation. It says if he had gotten his way, this birth certificate of the United States would not have gone out without his calling attention to this. And the fact that it's not quite logically accurate is even better, because it shows that he wants to talk about slavery and he doesn't know how to do it. And so the easiest way to do it is to lump it with all the other charges against George III, right?
Exactly.
So it's brilliant in its own way.
It is. And I think he actually, I would like to think, Clay, that he actually was really pained when the Second Continental Congress took it out, right? His description of it, as you know, in his autobiography is a paragraph long. But I think I would like to think it pained him so in a way that perhaps some edits did not, were not so deep.
Beau, thank you. We got to let it go for the moment. Come back. We'll talk about the great case Marbury v. Madison next in a few weeks. But remember that at the end, when Jefferson wrote about what happened in the Second Continental Congress, he said they mangled it. They mangled it. That's a strong word. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.